But I didn't think anyone would know who it was.
Yeah,
Here, we have some. We got spotters.
You remember New Mexico?
I was just thinking about that. I was telling
There's a lot of old minutes with RJ.
New Mexico.
I just acquired another one.
that was pretty good. Also, like staying at Justin's place.
Oh yeah,
Down in
there. I
Carlsbad,
forgot about that.
I'm going to give some of these out while I
I want to.
Here's Barry. Yeah, I'm surprised to see him.
I think we should take the rest of these now and put them somewhere else so everyone doesn't crap out. That's because yours is at your chair.
Active members.
give some of these out while
a lot of these people are here. Someone should now move. Someone should now start passing the barrel.
We're just trying to. There's no key.
I think we should take the rest of these now and put them somewhere else. So everyone doesn't crap out. That's because yours is at your chair. A lot of these people are here. Someone should now move. Someone should now start passing the barrel.
We're just trying to.
There's more names, yes.
I think we're take the rest of these now.
For a minute, I know
That's
I forgot to register. Yeah, I was wondering. But there could have been someone sensitive.
someone should now start passing the barrel.
I forgot to register.
So who's running this thing? Are you running this thing?
I'm running this thing.
Ask embarrassing questions, or are we all supposed to?
Yeah, I think we should. All right. I think we're going to try to get started. Get the badges later, and then
Okay, we're getting started.
Hey, everybody.
You don't want the
We're about to get this panel started.
Okay,
If you haven't got your name badge, you can get it between moving to the reception. So don't worry about that if you haven't picked it up yet. So if you could just take your seat, we'll get going soon. Got ideas. All right. I think it's about time to get started. So first, if our lovely panelists would introduce themselves.
Bob Frankston. Oh, been around forever. But I'll get to that later when we talk.
Why don't you just start with?
Should I just start?
Because I think we should go in history order.
History order.
So we've lined ourselves up in. Well, go ahead.
Sure. Let's introduce.
Introduce,
everybody.
give your years and
Year. What have you majored in? Anything interesting?
Let's see.
Now?
Okay, Bob Frankston. I transferred them every time I apply to MIT, I get rejected. So I transferred in '67. I was told about an experimental course called 6-3. But I also kept 18 because it could get me an extra year from the draft. Very important.
You might have to remind people what was going on there.
There was this little fight that has. What?
Explain what a draft is.
This is where this can be a long talk because part of the thing I want to convey is sort of a sense of the world back then. That I was interested in computers. I first learned to program when I went at Hunter College Center. My mother, in 1963, to learn to program the IBM 1620. It was a 20-digit computer. Could not do arithmetic. It had to do table lookup.
BCD?
What?
Binary
digits.
coded decimal.
Right. BCD wasn't even as fancy as 1401. Yes. I'll mention these. Part of the fun is using all these numbers. The problem is it's less fun if I realize how few people have get the references. But I got interested in computers back then. So in high school, I had a chance to play with computers. NYU generously provided time. I first got my first real job programming the SDS 940 computer in 1966 to create an online financial information service. And the reason this is relevant, by the way, is a grad student named Butler Lamson who helped us understand how, the system. So he was a great influence. He did a great lecture on how the operating system works. I really want to understand the operating systems, go back to that. But the important part for me was creating a service for people to use, an online service. So normal people can use computers. And I took a computer home with me, a terminal home, sorry.
Describe what the terminal is.
Okay, I'll describe what a terminal is, but
We still have the terminal. The VT100.
Yeah, the big
these
There's a
are
Raspberry Pi inside it now.
it basically went at 10 characters per second, 110 BPS. Later when I saw, we later got really fast terminals that printed 30 characters per second, and you couldn't imagine faster. But the reason I blurred the distinction between taking a terminal home and a computer is it gave me access to, I could do whatever I wanted. This was in '66 when people didn't know what computers were. So I could start to use it, to do, I'm going to blur the time scale, I'm going to do things like email. And my attitude was one day computers will be actually just day-to-day useful things and will actually disappear into the woodworks. They'll just be normal things for people to use. So when I got to MIT, one of the things, how do you share this access to computers? And there was this information utility project called Multics back then. Now, I just want to tell you, most of you, who does not know what Multics was or actually is, but you can still log into it? Okay. Multics, there's a whole discussion on Multics, but very briefly, all the operating systems you see now are based on Multics. Unix was a castrated version of Multics, done by some Multics members who found themselves isolated in their labs without a computer. But the real idea of Multics was to make it possible for normal people to use computers for day-to-day activities, which resonated very well with my interest in sort of sharing the power of computers, not just computers themselves, but the power of computing. And the reason I use email was, if you think of computing back then, it was much too expensive to use for day-to-day activities. So I was privileged enough, because I was on the inside working, to have basically unlimited use of computers, so I can do just my papers on computers. I was also fortunate enough to actually be associated with the main trends, the West Coast effort. The people who did the 940 created Xerox PARC. There was the Multics group, and also the IBM group, VM group, in the financial world and interactive data systems. So, it was fun to basically be, one nice thing about in those days was some of us as students knew as much about computing as the professors, because they were recycling used EE. Yeah, they're recycling, or more in some cases, and there's some interesting characters, like the infamous Donovan and things we'll go into. As a matter of fact, if you ever get a chance to get a hold of the September 1966 issue of Scientific American, I'd read that when I showed up at MIT. These people were there, the same people. So it was a very interesting time in that sense, because now originally I wasn't going to major computers, but I thought I knew everything. I programmed everything. I'm still learning new stuff. And so one of the people, we decided how are we going to give students, share this information utility with students, and not just Multics or other computers around campus, but Multics was sort of the center of a lot of it, even though a lot of people wanted to use SPSS on punched cards to do bad statistics. So we came up with a scheme, and I was not the most expert in student politics. Dave Burmaster, Gary Goot helped us. I don't know what, I think people try to get in touch with them. I don't know what happened. And Ed Fox was another student, I think a year behind me. He was on the list. I don't know if he's coming either. Came up with this plot. So we were going to basically ask MIT to donate the CTSS computer, which used to be in Building 26. That library in Building 26, that was the main computer room for the world.
CTSS is?
CTSS, okay. No, I'll give a brief history. Again, I could go out, this is the short version, was basically one of the very earliest time sharing systems. The SDS 940, which is the Berkeley system I used, but CTSS came first. It was sort of more, the first generation. Well, Dartmouth had basics. So the order, again, I don't want to go into the full history, but John McCarthy in 1958 came up with the idea of time sharing, and CTSS was the high point in the early 60s. Professor Fernando Corbido, who died recently, he gave some nice talks about that. And Multics was basically everything you learned with CTSS. What is amazing, again, each of these is long story, so how much computing had changed from the 1960, when people were using tubes and plug boards and everything, to 1970, when we had an online system which, I mean, if you look back at it, it's still very primitive, but basically holds its own against many of today's systems. If you go to multicians.org, you could look, there are virtual multixes you can log into and use your Unix knowledge to navigate it, because Unix is based on the same design. But I'm getting a little off. So the strategy was to ask MIT to donate that CTSS computer to students so we can provide access, they can use it. Now, we knew if they ever gave it to us, we wouldn't know what to do with it. The worst scenario would be MIT agreeing to give it to us. But it established a precedent, and one of the advice I mentioned was this acoustic psychologist. Now, this comes into play later, that he was an acoustic psychologist as a Bob Taylor, because he basically was J.C.R. Lickladder, who helped create Project Mac, and got the funding for shared computer projects, including Multics. And later, Bob Taylor at Xerox PARC was an acoustic psychologist who managed the people who gave us the rest of the internet. And the reason I mention psychologists is they focused on what do people do with it. How do you create shared experiences and all of this, where the computing devices were a means. And I played both sides of this. I mean, I was fascinated with computer programming and everything, but I always kept in mind the high-level goals of how do we make it more useful. So the other thing about that time was, how do you finance computer time? The problem was you couldn't give it away for free. There was all this excess time, but the government rules and everything said you were not allowed to give it away. So the students basically we got a real allocation of money. Now, remember, there's a factor of 10 inflation since then. So I think we'll give it $10,000 or $100,000. We'll give it $100,000, which is a student organization in 1969 with $1 million budget by today's standard.
But there's a catch.
Well, no, it was real. No, it was real. No. Let me explain. It was real money, but constrained use. So it's funny money, but the thing is, the computer time, we were paying real prices for computer time, because it wasn't just Multics, but other systems. So it had to balance with the MIT books.
But it's funny because it's arbitrary numbers.
No.
You pick a number and say.
No, actually, no, they were real. No,
It had
these
to
are
appear
real
in the MIT
numbers.
budget.
No,
Stuff
no,
like that.
No.
No.
The government would not think about it that
no, they were real numbers because when you got a research grant, this was a portion of the money to actually pay for the hardware, for the rent,
Yeah.
for the equipment. So the important thing is to understand, this was real money, it was constrained, so, we took it more casually than if we had, $1 million in the pocket, but it had to work against the budget of real money.
One way to think about it is that the administration was subsidizing computing and it was funneling that subsidy through a student organization.
Yes, and it was a great cause. And there were a few things that started about the time. There's Europe and IAP, which was started at the same time. So this was part of the larger movement at the time to sort of give students the ability to, be on their own and to sort of explore ideas. So all these were happening together. So the timing was fortunate. I do remember being treasurer, losing $10,000, couldn't figure out what happened to it. And that was like, picture on your budget, you lost $100,000. I'm not sure they ever found it.
The other thing on that first year, though, is that we weren't just paying money for things. We were jawboning people to give away some resources for free. My first involvement was the East Campus Computer Project, where we got to use the 1130 in the basement of Sloan for free.
Mm-hmm.
And I got involved because I knew which buttons to push on an 1130 to make it go.
And that's an important part of it because Jim Rothney, who, again, is not here, eventually became executive at PDMC, was hired to do a survey of the computers around campus, a computing resource around campus. And so the dollar time was primarily for Multics, but whatever we can do to make computers available, and we had basically, I was worried we were getting a little too bureaucratic. We had forms A, B, and C. And some of them got a little overzealous about enforcing the rules and stuff. Because we didn't want people basically running a for-profit business out of this, but how hard do you enforce it, and what do you do, and all these were open issues. But for the most part, I think it works smoothly. Now, at one point, I wanted to practice writing a compiler. So one night, I wrote a basic compiler.
I thought it was a weekend.
It's actually a weekend. Okay, take 2 nights. It was I was proud.
Okay, let's not have fights between the two Franks.
Yes. So I was proud of my work. I could talk to you about clever things. And then about a month, this is all much more fun than doing my master's thesis. By the way, my undergraduate thesis was on limited computing services, on how do you give a limited service subsystem on Multics so you constrain what computers, how much time people used. Dan Brooklyn I met because he implemented it. So a lot of these names keep recurring, and this is part of the experience. But so I decided I'm going to wrap a service around this. So I created basically an interactive computer service where you didn't have to sign up for it. You can just go to the terminal, create an account without asking anybody. And I made it available. Next meeting, I was censured.
And we voted to continue the service.
All right, I think that's probably a good point. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance.
No, I know, I could go on, but I'm glad to share. Well, actually, one last comment, I'll get to later. It is saying...
More than you to stop off.
I know. No, there are a lot of people who succeed. But okay, in any case, no, yeah.
Where's the gavel?
The disappointment I have is that we're still too aware of the computing part, and it should have just disappeared, or we should just be assuming computing.
There are mics on the table too, so we don't have. Yeah, we don't have to pass it around. You should be able to.
We could be able to just talk into this, huh?
Yeah, you should.
Okay. So my name is Joe Dean. I was a student, an undergraduate from 1971 to 1975. I was SIPB chair from 1973 to 1975. So Bob and his cohort kind of got things rolling. And I know Bob has this multi-centric view of it, but that's not what I saw when I came to SIPB. When I came to SIPB, the transition had happened from forming the organization to being an ongoing organization. an ongoing organization that provided services to students. And the services that we provided at that time were largely based on the IBM 360 style mainframe computer, which the Information Processing Center operated, and that was the main central computer for what we did. We did do that.
Don't worry.
You may not approve, but this is what we did.
We had this argument.
Ignore my editorial side.
It was
So-
a big part of what we were.
It was extremely big part, and that is actually where most of the money went to. When you talk about that 100,000,
SPSS.
most of it went to people running programs on this mainframe computer.
Was this MIT VMA or was this?
No, this was not a VM.
It was prior.
And it was not on any kind of internet or anything.
MVS.
It was
It's
not
OS.
on. It was completely separate. It wasn't connected to anything.
OSMVS.
And it had different. There were different versions of. It wasn't that then though. It was just. It was OSMFT or something.
Did you use piece of cardboard?
MVS, MVT.
MVS.
Depends on what year. They kept having new
Variable
versions.
partitions, but yeah.
Yeah, anyway, so there was this big.
Punch cards?
Yes,
Yes.
punch cards. So I'll describe it, okay? So what we had as students would come to us, and we had this $100,000, and it was our job to somehow make this useful to students. And obviously, you're not going to give all, 50,000 to one student and 50,000 to another student. So we had a series of different strategies for making these big, expensive computers available to as many people as possible for as many different uses as possible. And we had roughly divided, the way we thought of them at that time, we had services that you had to apply for. You had to say, I want to do this project. I think I'm going to need about this much computer time. Most of the time they had no idea how much they needed, and we had to figure it out for them. And we did not have unlimited resources. $100,000 may have sound like a lot of money in those days, but still, we're talking about thousands of students potentially wanting to use it.
Expensive computing.
Yeah, and this is where nobody sees computers this way now, but the way an operation like the Information Processing Center managed its services was by accounting for every little bit of resource use. So if you used a computer, you would be charged by the second of CPU time. You ran a program and something would be counting, this thing used 2.5 seconds. And there was a price per second of computing time. Depending on the operating system, you may also have been charged for I/O operations. So every time you read or wrote to the disk drive, you got charged.
There was not millicents like today.
No, it was then when you did your output, it came out on a printer. You got charged by the page or the line or something like that. So our job was to make this money go as far as we could. So we had services where we would actually give out accounts to students. They'd say, I want to do this project. It's going to, maybe I can get it done in $50 worth of computer time. And we'd say, yeah, maybe you can. Try it. Come back if you need more. And we had the infamous Form B. Where is Form B? Form B. So what Form B was a single sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper where the student would fill out all this basic stuff, his name and,
By hand.
I do
Yeah,
think
by
we
hand,
still
right?
have some copies of these.
Yeah, there are some in the office.
office.
So the basic idea was that the student would say, I'm working on this project. And by the way, it wasn't only students. We actually felt our mission was to serve the wider MIT community. We actually had sometimes faculty members would come in to us because they had no other way of getting a computer time. At that time, there was the Central Computer Center, and some departments had their own computers. Computers that would look like mainframes to us now physically, but were the power of,
Less than
that, right. But some departments had, like the mechanical engineering department had their own. Several of the other departments that were not specifically computer oriented had their own. And then of course, the people who are actually involved in developing computer technology had their own computers for their projects. But if you were just, say, in the chemistry department and the chemistry department didn't have a computer, where'd you go? And sometimes they came to us. Anyway, we would take these things and these forms, and we had a process where up to a certain amount, I don't remember if it was like $25 or $50 or something, the person in the office taking the form could automatically authorize it. Just up to some amount, individual SIPB members could say, yes, you can have this account. Anything higher than that would go to the next meeting. So the next Monday, somebody would read the forms and say, oh, here's somebody who wants $200 for this, and we had this little debate about it, and we'd vote on it. And at that time, when in the very early 70s, most of that was going to batch processing on the IBM 360, then became 370 system, and it was when I started all punch cards. There was this is all in Building 39. There was a room full of key punches. Students or anybody else who wanted to use the computer center would go in there, type their programs on cards, bring them over to the operator at a desk, and it would get fed into the machine, and then half hour later, 2 hours later, who knows, back you'd get your printout, which would say, this job failed because you can't understand this control card. And why don't you let me tell the story, okay? I'm sure they've seen a punch card. You've seen a picture of a punch card. It's a piece of cardboard around like that. It has 80 columns, each representing, it's like one character, and you would put your programs on a sequence of these things. They were like lines of a file, except they were a physical pile of cards. And they would come back with this thing, and more often than not, it would say, job failed, and then some obscure error message would be something like, I don't know, AR7432 system failed or something. That was the error message. And so what would they do? So this is when SIPB started getting into the business of consulting for students who didn't know how to get their program to run. So people would come into the SIPB office and say, hey, my job failed, what do I do? And we would look at it. Some of us were experts on the 360. Some of us really never used the 360, but we could look at a line of code.
We had a stack of manuals, too.
We had a stack of manuals, but most of the time it was because they forgot a comma in the control line. So some of us, even though we were not experts in this so-called job control language, we did know things like how to balance parentheses and that there should be commas between parameters and things like that. So we would look at it and apply whatever expertise we had to say, it looks like you probably missed a comma. And they were so grateful because we solved their problem.
Yeah, but then, once you got past JCL, you still had to get it to compile.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, this, of course.
We have a question.
Yes.
So at the time, computers cost more during the day than at night, and punch cards would typically be loaded onto a tape and run in sequences of jobs. So how did SIPB?
Okay, so on this operating system at the time, as far as I know, they were not preloaded onto a tape, and I do not believe that IPC had time of day accounting. There was, you would be more likely to get your job through at certain times of the day.
So my first actual job at MIT was in the operations center, taking those card decks from grad students, putting them in the hopper, running them through, and handing them back. Yep. And I'll tell you a great prank about that later.
Okay. So I'm just I just want to give a summary of the kinds of services, because we're going to get through different eras. You're going to hear different services. So Bob wanted all the money to go to Multics, but it couldn't go to Multics because although Multics was very good at keeping track of how many seconds of CPU time you used, it wouldn't stop you if you used more. So if we said you have $25, it eventually got fixed, but I'm talking about 1971, 1972. CTSS, which by the way stood for Compatible Time Sharing System. I'm not sure what it was compatible with. I guess the batch system. But that was being phased out, so we had a few people using that. And we wanted to put people on Multics, but we couldn't put people on Multics because if we said you have $25 worth, and they started using Multics, and 3 days later they had to run up a $25,000 bill, well, there was a quarter of our whole yearly budget. So we couldn't do that. At that time, similarly, the IBM mainframe did not have a time-sharing option, an interactive option, that allowed us to do what we called limit-stop accounting. Eventually, both of these, by the time I graduated in 1975, both the IBM mainframe and Multics were capable of doing that. I just want to add one thing. We had, in addition to those services, we had what we called free services or unrestricted services. This is where we took a chunk of computer resources and we dedicated them to some limited way of accessing a computer. Bob has already mentioned one, was called ECS, Educational Calculator Service. So I want to mention two other styles that existed in that era so you can get the perspective as we go forward in time. We had, in addition, if you just wanted to run a Fortran program, we had a service called, originally it was Watt4, then it became Watt5 based on the University of Waterloo system. They had developed a system to manage students' jobs that had its own accounting in it. So we had a nightly run. There was a tray, a card tray, in one of the rooms next to the key punch room, and any student who wanted to run one job a night could stick in their deck into this card tray, and it would get run. And there was a limit, like a certain number of seconds your job could run, and it was a very low cost of entry thing for a student. They could just, no questions asked, no application, no Form B, run whatever Fortran program you wanted, as long as it didn't run very long. In a similar vein, we had, some of you probably heard of the programming language APL, which was developed at IBM. It was a language that had completely different syntax than most programming languages. So different that it had a completely different character set, which meant you had to have a completely different terminal in order to print these characters. It was actually a IBM 2741, but you had to have a special typo.
Or the Multics software.
This was not on Multics, Bob. Not everything was on Multics. Eventually was on Multics. So the way we did that was the Information Processing Center had a second IBM mainframe that ran CPCMS, which is a virtual machine operating system. You could run other operating systems in it. APL, as developed by IBM, was its own time-sharing system, its own operating system that provided the APL language. So they had a virtual machine running the APL time-sharing system under it, mainly for use by the electrical engineering department by Core 6. But we had allocated to us for, I think, $5,000 a year, one terminal continuous use of this. And we had a terminal in Building 10 where any student could go in and use APL in like 15-minute chunks, sign-up sheet on the door. And
Joe, don't skip over the fact that CPCMS was like the first virtual.
Yeah,
Just
not enough time.
See, I did say that it was a virtual machine operating system, and it was developed across the street. But the way we used it, it's supposed to be a SIPB panel, not a history of computing panel. The way we used it was by essentially buying one little sliver of one terminal's worth of it, and we had a sign-up sheet on the door, students could come in. So we provided APL for free, limited time, Fortran for free, and then we had come in and apply with your Form B to get IBM mainframe, or gradually going to Multics and other services. Now we come to the late 1970s.
At Sloan for free. That was
Okay, that wasn't administered by SIPB as far as I know.
It was.
Was? Okay.
Oh, yeah, but it was dead by.
It was before.
Hang on.
That was before his
It
time.
was dead by then.
But he,
Okay, so.
so let's go to the late 70s here.
Charles Francis.
There's a question from the audience.
Where?
Barry. So earlier, while you were talking, you mentioned someone could come in and fill out a form, and the person in the office could authorize it.
Yes.
That suggests that there were people in the office. So
Yes, there were people.
When I arrived, what the people in the office were doing was playing on computers, because we all had them. What did you do in the office in 1971?
Well,
We held official office hours.
So it was staffed. It was like
You would sign up. If you go, and Joe and I just checked the minutes from 1972. In our minutes for the meeting was actually, we were officially open Monday through Friday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. And there are actually people signed up
Office hours.
for office hours.
But the one terminal, so you can.
One terminal. We had one terminal.
There was
in the
a
office.
terminal. There was a terminal.
I think this is a good segue. You
Yes.
can
Yeah, so,
introduce
so
yourself.
Late 1970s.
I'm more than late 70s, 72 through 84 with a gap in between.
And your name? Introduce yourself.
Oh, Charles Frankston. Do not ask if there's any relation.
In the summer.
Couple of comments. So when we got limit stop accounting on Multics, we by and large started transitioning to Multics. And Multics was the system that could cost a different amount. So we would tell students not to use it in the middle of the day. And you could actually get a lot out of your Multics money, especially in the late 70s. They went to fixed price. So it used to be you'd log into Multics and you'd get charged for CPU time as well as memory usage and disk I/O and there was this formula of memory usage and disk I/O which got to be called Frankston's because someone made up the formula.
It's a random number.
That would be part of the charge. But then they basically went to like $3 flat price per night. And that was a really good deal. So we give someone $100 of computer time. I forget it was $3 or $5, but they basically get 20 hours of terminal use. Whereas if you got $100 on the mainframe, you might get to run your job 20 times. So that's kind of like, so by the time I got there, some of these other services, Watt 5 was still going, but the APL terminal was gone, the 1130 was gone, so we were really just giving out time on the computer center. But to follow on Emma's gaffe in the movie of there was just one big computer, there were plenty of computers on campus. A lot of them were pretty small compared to the computer center computers. And one of the things that started happening is socially, first of all, a lot of us would just start hanging out at the SIPB office a lot, until the point where the office hours became almost meaningless because there was almost always somebody there. And I'm talking about into the wee hours of the night even. There were also SIPB members who essentially had jobs or Europs all over campus. And so we were involved in these many other computers. We couldn't give out time on them, but we were SIPB members became part of the computing milieu all over campus. And we actually used to give, during rush week, was it? Tours of all the computers on campus. Because most of us worked there, we just asked, hey boss, can we take some students around? And we actually even had an inventory of practically every computer on campus. And it was 30 or 40 of them. Most of them were mini computers, however. Okay, that's part of the computer milieu. I left and came back to finish my degree, so I'm also going to talk about the 80s, which means I'm now switching places with Dan.
Charles, before you move on, wasn't this phase when SIPB began to also focus on capital budget?
We got a little bit of a capital
Yeah, I'll
budget.
talk about that. Yeah.
Don't forget-
I'm not sure my memory is as good.
And don't forget the list, of course.
Yeah, well, that's a little.
Well, there's more activities, yes.
Right. So, yeah, and maybe I'll ask you to speak to that. But also, I'm Dan Halbert. I'm class of '78, and I was there in a conventional time, 74 to 78. So I was chair from 76 to 78. I came in and also started hanging out in the SIPB office because I'd used computers in high school and before that. But and tomorrow, I have a talk tomorrow, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about personal history, so I won't go into that right now. But what I want to say is, at the time I arrived, yes, we were trying to mostly give out time on Multics, and as Charles said, the charge was, say, roughly $3 to $5 an hour. To make a printout that's 20 pages, 20 line printer pages long, could easily cost you $2 or $3.
You know what a line printer is?
Yeah. So this is, and minimum wage at this time was like maybe $3.50. Okay, so this is a significant amount of money. Tuition was $33.50.
Could have gone up.
Yeah. Yeah. Tuition has gone up much faster than inflation. But yeah. So at the time that I was there, we did finally, after some leaning on the administration. I'll also like to say it's called the Student Information Processing Board because there was an information processing board, which was full of adults. And I think they gave us the money. Okay. So that's why it has this funny thing at the front and how the rest of the name came from, because there was an IPB as opposed to just a SIPB. So we did eventually ask for a capital budget because we wanted to start having putting terminals in the dorms and other places, and maybe some frats or something. Because at the time, there were very few terminals. You usually had to go to a central place to use the terminals. So eventually we got a capital budget. I'm not really sure what year it was, maybe roughly 76 or so.
No, earlier.
We gave terminals out to fraternities in the early 70s.
Yeah.
Model 38s.
Okay, yeah, we had a few of those,
There
right.
were 2741s before
We
that.
had one in the
No,
basement of
2741s were
this campus
first.
that I remember, and since I graduated in 73, it had to be before.
Okay.
So you're confusing two different things. There's putting terminals out and capital budget. When we started putting the terminals out, it was not a capital budget. In addition to the $100,000 for computer time, we had two other kinds of money, two different accounts. We had something on the order of 12 to 20,000, it varied from year to year, I think, out of a telecommunications budget, and that was an annual amount, and that's what we used for paying for the terminals. Most of that went to paying for terminals, and terminals you had to rent at that time. You had to rent the modems. This was before the Carter phone, whatever, and you had to actually pay the phone company, I mean, through MIT, because MIT had a bulk deal, but you had to pay by the month for every phone, modem, whatever. And so we had to rent a terminal, and we started with IBM 2741s, I'm pretty sure, and then we switched to the TTY 38s because they were less expensive, and so we could get more of them for the same amount of money. We also paid for that, out of that, the office phone. And then we had we had a much smaller amount from, whatever, FinCom, whatever, the Finboard, the student activity, that was on the order of $1,000 or something. So we had those three different things. And then I don't know if it actually went explicitly to a capital budget, but we realized at somewhere around 74, 75, we realized we're paying rent on these things. If we could just buy them, and maybe we'd get half as many this year, but we'd have them again next year, and we could buy some more. And I don't know if that actually required we did that. I don't know if that was an explicit turning it into a capital budget, or we just said we want to spend it this way. Yeah.
Well, right, we didn't have very many of them. And then Digital Equipment Corporation came out with the LA36, which was an inexpensive printing terminal, and we were able to really buy a bunch more for most of the dorms. And that was 30 characters per second instead of 15. Yeah. And there was one for the office too. So we started putting them in closets or basements of various dorms, and they still had to use paper, and it was like an onerous job, like who's going to deliver a box of paper? We tried to get interdepartmental mail to do it, but they got pretty mad at us.
I chose not to go with CRTs because they need to print.
A quick little side note, I was the secretary at the time, so this is the dawn of online minute taking. So you see all those text files that was me starting at a printing goddamn terminal running.
That's right, but you would run it with echo off, so it wouldn't bother us. So he'd be typing blind into this terminal. So, and then I won't say much else, so we can go on to the other people. But around 77, 78, MIT was beginning to talk about creating something that sort of turned into the Athena clusters. And so they talked about getting a bunch of smaller computers, and we were somewhat distressed by this because they didn't seem to have any clear plans about. The great thing about Multics was that it was a shared system, so that people could share code, they could share files, and
email.
And it was not clear that the same thing was going to happen on this other kind of like more distributed computer system and email, right? And so I wrote a position paper on this, which just said, if you're going to do this, just make sure that you don't lose the advantages of having the big shared system.
There's a question from the audience.
Yeah.
Well, it's more of a comment. Rick Revolter, class of 79, or KAT. So I think one thing you skipped over in the 70s, which I think also increased people hanging out in the office, was the ITS terminal, which came from somewhere in one of the buildings. I don't know if maybe Bill or someone could talk.
That was kind of late 70s. That was when MIT, the ChaosNet started to spread around campus, and yeah, we were capable of getting a network.
The Plasma Physics Center.
Right, Plasma Physics.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah, that was essentially free computing with like no login.
Yeah, we'll be really sidetracked if we talk about SIPB people like that.
well, the other thing is, I guess I want to say one more thing about that. In late 70s, just when I was leaving, we decided to start giving money out on Multics for text processing, so people could write their thesis, their bachelor's theses online.
I'm going to get there. Let's take Isaac's.
Okay.
Did you have instant messaging back then, or did it come after?
He wrote it on Multics. Send message, but it had to be on Multics. It wasn't between.
It had to be on Multics to get it.
Well, yeah, basically, I was.
There was no personal device.
I was working in my office 10 miles away, so I need to communicate to my program. That's the way you do things.
So yeah, but that gets beyond the SIPB. So two more quick things actually: the word processing and the thing he got censured for. So it turned out, and I'm not quite sure why, by like 77, 78, the end of year tenure, we were actually having a hard time spending our full $100,000 budget. So we did two things. One was he wrote that calculator system over a weekend and made it available via anonymous login on Multics without waiting for approval first, which is why we censured him. But it also helped soak up a good part of our budget. So remember, this was before this was a programmable calculator back then. It was a $4,000 device that was that big, right? And so anyone who wanted all over campus could just log in and use this as a programmable calculator. If they wanted to save their files, they would come into the SIPB office and ask for an account.
No, we have to log in.
And we used to forbid word processing because we were afraid it would basically just chew up our budget.
Because it was so useful.
Because so useful. And at a certain point we just said, oh, what the hell, and we bought a very nice quality printing terminal, which we had one of in the office, so people could do word processing and come and print out their papers. This was basically to soak up our budget, and both of these were pretty successful.
And was that the beginning of the stapler as a core service?
No. I have to tell you, the stapler is purely a result of the location of the office, of the current office next to an Athena cluster and the printers.
And printers.
The printouts used to come on fanfold paper, so nothing. But we did have the service of printing. All right, so now I'm going to transition to the 80s, because I left and I came back in 82. And it was still pretty much the same thing. It was Multics, very much less IBM mainframe. Multics was more cost effective. The SIPB had become even more of a social organization and stuff, which was very nice for me coming back to finish my degree. And most of the people I knew, except for some of us who didn't quite succeed in graduating on time, also weren't around anymore. So
I started.
But things were kind of getting, I don't know how to put it, it seemed like we could and should do better, that whereas we had once been ahead and MIT had once been ahead in making computers accessible to students, wasn't necessarily the case. More and more courses were using computers. So Wendy Rowe was chairman, I followed her for a semester as chairman. We wrote a paper to the Institute basically saying, this giving out nickels and dimes on Multics isn't going to do it anymore. Could you please just buy the SIPB one VAX 750? Okay, a VAX 750 was about a MIP, 0.5 MIP per second, digital VAX. And we kind of got this strange response, and I'm trying to remember I don't remember clearly who we talked to, but they kind of said, yeah, we thought your proposal was interesting, just wait a while. Sure. And then they came back with Project Athena and said, how about 2,000 such machines? So, I became the first student rep to Project Athena, even as it barely existed, and there's some nice war stories on Athena, but yes, basically these clusters started appearing all over campus and more computing than we could possibly imagine. And that started the transition of the SIPB, because we weren't just giving out computer time anymore. And 84 was just at the beginning of this, and I did hang around a little after graduating, but the later people should probably pick up the story from that.
I can tell you a funny story about what happened at Center for Space Research when this happened. We ordered a VAX, and it got lost because DEC just shipped it to MIT.
Oh.
We're all the rest of 77 NASA.
Okay, there was a difference. The VAX 750 would have been a time sharing system with terminals. Yeah. What Project Athena got were workstations with graphical screens and a mouse.
They started with 750s. Okay.
Well,
I think the one I'm talking about was actually a microvax, but I don't remember.
Probably.
All right, one more comment from the audience and we'll move down the line.
This Project Athena started with 750s and BT100 terminals. Then each 750 got a VS100 workstation.
Yeah, okay.
The vision was the 3M machine, 1 million pixels,
Right.
1 megabyte of RAM, and 1 million instructions per second. And
And
that cell phone there.
Or $10,000.
Right, and
Right,
that
right,
cell phone
but this was the dream,
A billion
the ultimate
instructions.
computing device.
We got the microvaxes, but the problem at the beginning was all of these machines were individual time-sharing machines, and that there was no underlying infrastructure. And so Cliff Newman, who's not here but was
Right.
at SIPB, wrote Kerberos
For his
as
undergraduate thesis.
And so Kerberos is an undergraduate thesis, and we're all using it.
Yeah.
And they couldn't get the distributed file system working, but fortunately, CMU developed one over at
Well, CMU had Project Andrew, which started almost a year before Project Athena, but was almost the same thing. And they were doing the Andrew file system, which, by the way, Ted Anderson, another SIPB member, ended up...
And Mike Kazar.
And Mike Kazar, another SIPB member, ended up working on, yes.
And the thing that everybody forgot, so the purpose of both Andrew and Athena was to integrate computers into education. That was the purpose, and the vision was sold as these amazing applications, like students would be able to draw bridges and calculate forces. It wasn't about word processing. It wasn't about learning the programs. It was about these educational programs. And the thing that everybody forgot was there were no toolkits for building educational programs. And it turned out to be really hard to do.
And Simpson, there were institutional incentives to not do that. That was not what was rewarded for tenure and all this stuff.
Right.
But we were like, well, we'll use it for word processing and just general computing stuff while they try to figure out this educational.
Yeah.
So, well, I got.
Good segue.
Yep.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Stan Zanarati, username SRZ. I got to MIT in 1985 as a grad student. I had walked into the SIPB office with a Multics t-shirt, which confused people a lot because they were wondering, is this like an alum coming back with Multics? And I had just gotten there. And another little thing, our first VAX 11750 that we got from Project Athena was called Charon, C-H-A-R-O-N. I think the link into the underworld is there.
Yes.
You know, while I was a prospective, I showed Ken Rayburn a bunch of pictures I had, including my car, whose license plate was MULTIX, and he went over to the Charon terminal and he typed SU, because that was the root password at the time. And he showed that to me while I was a prospective, but I had my license plate was a root password, even though I didn't know it. So that was sort of how I came into it. We were at that point of time, we were still giving out some Multics accounts for word processing. You know, Athena was starting to roll out a bit, but it was starting to die down. I mean, we still had all the, you know, the forms, registering the users on Multics. That was a lot of what was done. We still had people coming in to ask for special projects, and that was in the meetings. One little aside, Joe Dean is Joseph of Joseph Jeffrey Sipiad.
JJ Sipiad.
Just for people to know that, JJS, as is sometimes known.
Jeff Broughton. Jeff Broughton.
No, I asked you, you know who Jeffrey is.
That I don't know.
It's Jeff Broughton.
Jeff Broughton.
Yep. And so we were starting to try to figure out what we do. And you know, I was involved as a student from 85 to 89, you know, long grad student tenure for a master's. But we were trying to do things. We started to do some development work on Discuss, you know, working on, you know, a shared meeting system there. We, you know, we had a lot of SIPB members overlap as watchmakers as part of Project Athena. So we did a lot of, we were trying to figure out what's the next generation of SIPB. Now that computer time is a lot more prevalent, we didn't have to give out accounts. And so, you know, we worked through that in various ways. And how are we doing on time? I just want to be
I think you're still good.
27 minutes.
27 minutes. Okay.
To finish,
Still get
finish
to,
another
still on
20
track
years.
to introduce everybody.
Long introductions. You know, I think we also were bringing, and I can't speak for the early 80s, but we were certainly bringing in the perspectives into things a little bit more. I mean, we had a big class of people coming in, both in 85 and 86. Andre, you came in 86, I believe. We had a whole bunch of microvaxes coming in at that point, and we wanted to include the perspectives into the naming system. And I think that's where we chose the Bloom County methods, use of the various microvaxes. I don't know if we still have some of those remnants there. But it was a mix. You had how to double space and easy, because word processing was still important on Project Athena. Back in those days, before the AFS Andrew file system, Athena was originally trying to have individual non-shareable things, RVDs, remote virtual disks. And I think people sort of pushed AFS and maybe NFS, first NFS and then AFS onto Athena over his objections because they wanted sharing of the data. Huh?
Who's the his objection?
Sulzer.
Sulzer,
Because he was technical director, I think, of Project Athena at that.
Was this when the Essentials started?
I think I don't know if we had any Inessential Multics. It might have been when the Inessential documents were for documentation.
Didn't Athena have a series of essential documents?
Yeah. Right.
We put out the inessential documents.
Right. So we were always trying to fill in the gaps for what Athena did. We ran NetNews. That was one of our big services, which is a distributed messaging system, which allowed you to post something, and then through the network it would just get propagated everywhere, and there was really no editing or stuff. So you could put copyrighted material on, you could put racy pictures on it. It would be all it. And SIPB ran that service, and that was one of the bigger services that we ran over the years. NetNews, dealing with the emails and other things at that point.
And I didn't think it as exceptional at the time, but listening to the track, we wanted SIPB would have its software. Right? So LaTeX, at the time it was LaTeX or what have you. So this is the point where we had a shared computer, everybody had this.
The SIPB
This
locker.
is what we expect, but there's a set of stuff that this is a set of software that SIPB installed and maintained. So that was a set of stuff that people could use. It sounds like maybe that was. I mean, there's some of that. It sounds like maybe there's a bit of a transition there.
Well, even in the very earliest times, Bob, of course, talked about building whole systems from scratch himself. But even in the 1970s, SIPB members also contributed things to Multics as part of sort of a user-contributed library. So we would find some gap that the people who are developing the main system just didn't think was important, and then we would add that feature because we saw that it was useful to the kind.
The original Multics discussed was
the kinds of student users that we.
There were some things like Discuss and Stan and company actually also prototype graphical user interfaces. I think that nobody picked up, but things there. But actually, this is, I guess, just computing history. It had gone to the point where other people would have developed software that you could run on your machines, right? And so probably in the beginning, Multics, or whatever Multics had, right? But at this point, okay, you could go out and get LaTeX from someplace else and build it, and then so you would maintain some collection of software.
I mean, the point of Multics.
Between Stan and Liana, right, was a time when new undergraduates to MIT were used to using things like Word at home. They knew computers, but they didn't come with a computer. And the Athena terminals then were all of a sudden going to be this crazy different software you'd never knew before, right? I think that became a thing. So
try to educate.
And maybe this is a good segue.
I got just a couple interesting things.
All right.
I want to add that at a certain time, actual Multics developers like myself and Bill We're SIPB members.
Yes.
John.
Yeah, and John Rocco.
Doesn't lead to last one. Yeah, probably not.
Two other things that happened in that tenure that's interesting. One of which is we had a really good relationship with IS or IS&T at that point. I remember sitting in the office of Jim Bruce, who was the Vice President of Information Systems. He was faculty, he was on the academic council. He had a lot of clout around MIT being who he was. And I remember him
Schiller too.
Yeah, Schiller obviously, but he's sitting in his office and going over things because he had all these terminals in the books from these fraternities and over in the student center that had to be sort of cleared out, and he put in the time to sort of write them off and take care of it, and we just had this really good relationship with IS&T.
Jim Bruce was a change from the earlier IS&T, from the early IPC and IPS directors. He was really good to us, and actually he's the one that said, how about 2000?
Right.
We did get caught, I mean, we worked with the IPB people at the beginning, so it would have varied.
Yeah.
Right. So I just want to put that as that we have really good relationships, and it was in that time frame in 1988 that we got the new office. They were IS was giving up the space in Building 11. We were right outside one of the big printer stuff, and the student center was getting redone, and the big cluster was being put in there. So we I think almost doubled the space or so, and we had the move, and that was in 1989. We had the new office to show people at the 20-year anniversary to do that. So
that was the new office. That was
the new office.
From 11
to 11.
The first 39 to 39 to.
Yeah.
There were two 39s.
There were two 39s, but one was only for a very short
You
time.
had 39-200, and then you moved upstairs?
No,
we
it was
do
the
need
other
to
way
make sure,
around.
in the interest of time, we do need to move on.
I'm Liana Leroux. I got to MIT in 1996. I was class of 2000, and then I stayed for a few years working in the biology department. And I was SIPB chair actually after I graduated in 2001, because I was still technically a student.
That was when it was.
And so I showed up, sort of as Pratch just mentioned, at an interesting time. So it was an interesting time because Project Athena was really well established. SIPB's connection to that in terms of sort of adding in the extras, like the inessential support documents, was really central to what we did. But students were coming without their own computers when I showed up in 1996, so Athena clusters were still a really big part of your MIT undergrad experience. If you had to do a problem set, you probably pulled an all-nighter in the W20 cluster. And by the time I graduated, most students had their own computers in their dorm rooms, and especially their own laptops even. And so one of the really interesting things that happened during that time was that so Athena was still running on, so there were DEC stations, there were Sun Solaris boxes, and some SGI workstations still. But we all had PCs in our dorm rooms, and so one of the main things that SIPB was contributing to was Linux and NetBSD-based Athena implementation, so that we were allowing students to go reproduce the Athena environment on their personal computer in their dorm. And then that eventually shifted into Deb Athena, which was, I believe, a project SIPB started adapting Debian Athena, or adapting Athena for Debian, and then IS actually essentially picked that up as their...
Because that enabled you to buy commodity PCs instead of these highly priced workstations.
So by the time I graduated, almost every Athena workstation was an off-the-shelf PC instead of an expensive Unix box. And so so the other big thing that happened during so one great thing is that Stan was still an active part of SIPB when I got to campus. In fact, we spent a lot of time together. So he covers this wide range. But one of the things that happened in there was the web. And so originally, www.mit.edu was SIPB's web server. It was MIT's first sort of main web server, and it was a portal of information for students. And it included access to personal web space that students could use that was hosted by SIPB. And a lot of student groups had web space there. SIPB had its own resources there.
Wasn't it one of the first like 100 or 1,000 websites in the world.
Yeah, it was really quite early, and
Matthew Gray really was one of the pioneers there for us.
And it had, because everything was slower back then, so Ari Azawa had made these bitmap images, little tiny, very pretty images, so that we had graphics on our webpage that could load at a reasonable speed. And so, nonetheless, in the mid-90s, MIT realized it should probably also have an actual website. And so they got web.mit.edu. And so for most of the 90s, SIPB controlled www. And I was a webmaster for www. And it, of course, as the convention became stronger and stronger that the main website for a site was at that address, eventually towards, I think, just around when I was chair, initially IS asked if we would just basically mirror their content so that www displayed the content from web.mit.edu, and eventually, which actually created a lot of problems because our file structure was different, so if you used the same URL after the top level, it wouldn't work. But at any rate, eventually we did shift it over to IS's control entirely. But it was definitely a transition period, and
web.mit still works too.
It still works for sure. But it's now they're the same computer, they're the same, they're interfaces to the same set of servers now. And so I think that the challenge at the time when I was around was both in how did we, just like everyone else has said, how do we stay relevant as the computing resources change? How do we push computing forward? And I think that people did a really great job of making, for instance, making it so people could run Athena in their dorm rooms. And also, I think because SIPB had continued to be a very social community, I think we put some amount of thought into how to make the environment welcoming to a wide range of students and how to sort of keep the community aspects moving in a good direction. And Keith, yes, a kind of gentler SIPB. That's right. So Keith and I overlapped, and maybe this would be a good time for you to pick up the story.
I need to scoot near the mic.
Okay, and I'm Keith Winstein, Festival 3.
Swap seats.
I mean, I think, so I was at SIPB from 1999 until sort of 06, and then I came back to MIT 2011 to 2014, but I was less involved in SIPB. I think that sort of time, the 1999 to 06 time, it was sort of a time of transition. I mean, SIPB is unique. I'm now at Stanford, and someone asked me, Mauders Verza actually, I don't know if he's here, asked me like, Keith, what is the Stanford equivalent of SIPB? It really doesn't, there's not something like that. And I think it reflects the sort of way in which MIT students are, I think, uniquely focused on MIT. Like, MIT was like our home. And like Stanford students are much more externally focused. Like, let's start a startup or some BS like that. But like, this is not being videotaped, right? This is not being
Just say off the record.
Off the record, yeah. So, I mean, for me, SIPB, when I showed up, so I had been at a nerdy high school, and we had tried to have our own SIPB, because some of the good kids had gone to RSI, and they had hung out at SIPB over the summer, and they had come back with these stories about how this crazy organization worked, and so we adopted the SIPB constitution for our own little high school club.
That's how you do it so
We
well.
elected each other as members. And,
lying, I was also there.
yes. So when I showed up at SIPB, I mean, it had to be done right, the entry into the SIPB office, because this was like going to be a big moment, like in my life. Like this was like, it was like being called up to the majors, like because I had been in minor league SIPB.
Junior SIPB.
Yeah, junior SIPB. So I arrived at MIT August 24th, 1999, and it took me 2 days, like walking past the SIPB office to like properly steel myself for this moment. I remember I got caught in the Athena cluster on August 24th because it took a day to have your Athena account be activated. And by this point, Athena had already sort of was on the downward slope of coolness. But yeah, so I logged in as Prof. Root or Dr. Root. What is it now? No one will say. Good. That was okay. Whatever the current root password is, I logged in as root, and Lou immediately caught me. He's like, "Why are you logged in as root?" And I was like, "Well, I don't have my account yet." And it's like, "You're not supposed to do that." That was good. So then I eventually, after 2 days later, I was like, "Okay, this is the moment." And I tried to like walk in very quietly, and just as Matthew Belmonte says in that documentary, just like sit down at a computer, silence. Like I'll slowly like ingratiate myself And I asked, like, oh, is this computer Athena? And like immediately Camilla was like schooling me, like, no, this is not Athena, we're a volunteer student organization, and like telling me all these things. And like I knew, but of course I was like a very stressful moment.
The kinder, gentler Sippy.
Yes, also because Camilla sort of has an accent, but you're not supposed to talk about that, and I could not understand what she was saying to me. I just knew she was mad, and I wasn't doing the right thing, and all these people that I was trying to impress, you know, for my life were yelling at me, and that was my entry. And and Thomas Bushnell was there, and he's like, "Hi, I'm Thomas Bushnell." I was like, "The Thomas Bushnell?" And everyone was like, you know, because they're like, "How do you know?" It's like, "Oh, I've used the herd." And they're like, "Oh, don't stroke his ego anymore, Keith." And anyway, so the point is like this idea of SIPB as a service organization where people like act to help to tend their garden, to tend our garden, to tend the MIT garden is not common. Like, it's very common to have the ACM club or the IEEE club or the computer science club or like help get your resumes in order for cracking the coding interview. Like, that is common and that is everywhere. But an inward-looking club where you want to help people at your organization advocate for them or build things for them, that is unusual.
Yeah, and actually just, so I guess some of you maybe met with Berkeley's OCF this year. Yeah, so I'm a Berkeley faculty member now, and I don't really know very much about the OCF, but it is actually a very unusual thing to, I mean, because we all know Berkeley is better than Stanford, so.
So I remember when I showed up, they were like, "Oh, so exciting, you know, new blood. Like, what kind of service things as part of SIPB's mission do you want to get involved in?" Like, Nikolai Zeldovich is running our AFS servers. Maybe you want to get involved. Nikolai Zeldovich, now, you know, famous professor of computer science, running our AFS servers. Or these other people are running our web servers. And it was just in 1999. We just got our web page taken away, but we still run the web server, so that's fun, right? And I was sort of part of a new generation that was like, no, I don't really want to do these things. I'm just going to kind of hang out and suck in. I remember calling my friends from home, like my first week of freshman year. I'd just been on an Orange tour. And I was like so impressed. I was like, oh my God, this place, like there's the SIPB and there's the Orange tours, and like there's so much history. Like, people. And it was the same people. It wasn't the same people. And I was so impressed. Like, I was like, I don't know, like I'm so intimidated. And they were like,
in the same way that some people wanted punch cards described.
Yeah, Orange tours.
I'm not the right person to
Orange
describe
tours
it.
are an unauthorized tour of rooftops and steam tunnels and other places on campus, which are.
We did that. We didn't have
But
that
it
name.
generally had about 450 students a night, so it was quite an enterprise.
Yes. And you were all wearing different clothes then, and then I'd see you like an hour later in the SIPB. I was like, weren't you? Like, I'm Jack Floor. Anyway. Anyway, so there was a point to this. Well, yeah. So I said I was very intimidated by these people, and they said this was like Don, you know, and Gene. They were like, well, that's why you have to latch onto these people and leech and suck their brains and learn everything they have. And that was really very, very good advice. And I think the notion of SIPB is this sort of intergenerational knowledge transfer and mentoring. Yeah, it was really valuable. And I remember we'd sort of use it as like a National Geographic. Like you'd sit there and you'd go out and have adventures, and then you'd come back, and the best thing you could do was to tell other people this sort of National Geographic organization like what you did. Like Liana would do some protest, and then I wouldn't be there, but then they'd all come back in the SIPB office, like their staging ground, like, oh man, that was awesome. Like the Associate Director of Admissions just yelled at me, and they were like, MIT doesn't admit people like you anymore. Like they said that to you, right?
They said that to
They
me.
said, MIT doesn't admit you anymore.
What you mentioned of like you.
Rebellious people.
And Sam Hartman would come back from Sam Hartman would come back from IETF or something like that, and he'd be like, "Oh man," or from Debian, you know, all the complexities of Debian. You've been talking about that stuff, you know. So it's like you were bred to be the head of Debian.
Well,
like,
but I mean, and then like in the other thing, there was this night, right, where Keith, I forget who else was there, where we sat down and looked all through 15 CFR 735 through 750 something.
Oh yeah, for the encryption.
Right, basically, and like put together the set of questions that let us finally, for Debian and for all the derivatives, get past the US export law. And basically, I put together, with Keith's help, a set of questions that we then forwarded off to, effectively, HP's counsel. And HP's counsel was like, yes, you're right, you could totally do that. And apparently the legal hack we came up with of telling them about all the cryptographic software that might have crypto rather than having to figure out whether it did, like basically stunned everyone until finally years later, the NSA actually sent Debian a note, please stop. We're really getting tired of getting paperwork from you guys.
And actually that does bring up another big thing that SIPB was involved in around that time, because computer security and encryption, and I mean with file sharing and DVD distribution, computers were in the news, and we were caught up in trying to figure out how to advocate for our right to distribute software that some people didn't want us distributing, and that was definitely actually the hardest set of challenges I had as chair.
Wasn't there also something about that guy showing MIT that every one of their ID cards was insecure? Yes, Andre?
Yeah. They told us it was the cards were great. They were unhackable.
Right.
So, you mean they invited you to hack it?
What?
You mean they invited you to hack it?
Yes. That way, yes.
Yeah.
So we showed them what was encoded in there, but it was relatively easy to copy them, and it maybe just incrementing a 1 whenever you reissue 1 isn't terribly.
So for me, SIPB was kind of this home base where you would do these cool things, and there would be people there that sort of talk sense into you or tell you, that was all done. We used to have this saying, like, there's the right way and there's the wrong way, and then there's the MIT way, which is somewhere between the right way and the wrong way, but like 20 years earlier, and still around.
I remember that being the conflict between the East Coast and the West Coast.
Yeah, but I think what you also remind me of is the Multics project, in the sense not everything reminds me of Multics, but this particular attitude of programming, because the Multics programming community was a social community, like the open source attitude. You looked at other people's code, reviewed it, and there was that kind of working together, and we were building things, for people to use. It was a much simpler time in some sense, but like the Bell Labs people would do QED and Bond and games and things, and that was a version of that kind of feeling in society.
Yeah, I mean, stuff, people would tell, Mark Eichen used to be around, I really looked up to him, and they would tell me about the Hellman-Fiasis of the internet, when the internet worm, took over everything, and they were sitting up in the SIPB office all night, and they wrote this article, and they figured it out, and they called over to, I speak Berkeley, and they were like, we figured it out, and they were like, how do we know you're not the worm? Like, they're like, do you know who we are? This is the Student Information Processing Board. So I don't know, that was sort of what SIPB meant to me.
Stan and I were on vacation once in New Mexico, and we found that book with the full description of the Morris worm.
Okay, was that John's book or something?
Yeah,
oh, okay.
In their bookcase, and you left an inscription in it.
Oh, was it Chris Stoll? Maybe it was a Chris Stoll cuckoo's egg.
Oh, that's different. That's different.
Yeah.
Cuckoo's egg.
Yeah.
All right, and on that note, I think it's about time for dinner. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. So our dinner, the reception is going to be in the R&D Common on the 4th floor of Stata. We're all going to be heading over there, so if you don't know where that is, just follow the crowd. If you'd like to try and pick up your name tag, go ahead. We'll also bring them all to the R&D Common with us, so don't worry if you don't grab it right this second. Thank you very much, and see you in a bit. Yeah, I also. I'm so sorry. We have more bats in the office. I don't know if we can fix it right now, but we can get you a bat for the office later. Yes.
I must not have registered. I didn't see my name.